There is a room in the country that is so important that life as we know it depends on it. Your job, our trains and public transport, and most functions in our homes. This room, staffed 24/7 by highly trained teams of 18 engineers, is so important that it has a backup clone. This backup clone is at an undisclosed location in the country for security reasons, ready to take over in case a natural disaster or a hostile attack incapacitates the first room. But the function of the room is so vital to the nation that there is even a third facility which can take over in case both the first and the secret clone are taken out. And yet, most likely, you have never heard of this room. Hi, I'm Dr. Giordano Scarciotti. I'm an academic at Imperial College London in the Control and Power Research Group. And today I'm going to talk about an amazing facility which is located in Wokingham, a small town in the UK. While in this video I will talk specifically about the United Kingdom, a room like this exists in most large developed countries, and so most likely also in your country. I've been living in the UK for more than 10 years, and in this period I personally never experienced a blackout. Now, blackouts do happen in the UK, but they are very rare events. One may wonder, what is that causes a blackout? In 2003 I was living in Italy, and I do remember a massive blackout that happened in that year. The blackout was initiated in Switzerland when a tree came into contact with a transmission line, caused a fault, and this had a domino effect on the Italian power grid. The entire country, 57 million people, lost power for up to 19 hours. As a teenager at the time, my reasoning was that if a tree can cause such a huge disruption, then events that can cause a blackout must be rare, or otherwise we would experience them every day. But actually, it turns out that in the UK, for example, there are more than 3,000 failures per year of various entities that could cause a blackout. That's about 8 per day. And yet, despite these numerous faults, blackouts are very rare. How so? This is due to the existence of a room whose mission is to ensure that the nation is continuously powered. The engineers in this room are highly trained and constantly monitoring and adjusting the national power infrastructure to make sure that every house, every office, every plug receive electrical energy. We're talking of the National Energy System Operator, NESO for short, Control Centre. In this video, I will explain how the electrical grid works, what is the role of the NESO Control Centre, what causes blackouts, and how the Control Centre fights them. I will also cover, as a case study, the 19th of August 2019 UK blackout, which disconnected 1 million British users. I will explain what went wrong and how this may happen more in the future. So let's dive in. The power grid is like a scale, which needs to be perfectly balanced. On the one side of the scale, we have power generation. Electricity is generated nowadays by a combination of different sources. First, we have classical generation, which is generation produced by so-called synchronous machines. Classical generation boils down to a source of energy that produces a mechanical force. In most cases, the mechanical force is produced by creating steam by burning coal or gas or biomasses or by nuclear fission. In some other cases, the mechanical force comes from the kinetic energy of falling water, like in hydroelectric generation. Until 15 years ago, virtually all electric generation was classical generation. But in the last 15 years, there has been a tremendous shift in electrical generation, and in 2023, 29.4% of electrical energy in the UK was generated by wind farms. So now, in addition to classical generation, we also have many wind farms and solar farms, in addition to battery facilities which are used for storage. Now, if on one side we have generation, on the other side of the scale we have demand. Demand is caused by users like us switching on the lights, charging our phones, or making a tea. Demand is also caused by industry and companies powering their factories and offices, or by the public transportation system, powering, for instance, the underground. Now, the key thing to understand about electrical energy is that it is very difficult to store in large quantities. The energy amount required by the nation is so high that it's not possible to build big enough batteries to store enough electricity for everyone. Essentially, if there is a demand of electricity, that electricity needs to be generated on the spot. This means that generation and demand need to be in perfect equilibrium at every instant of time. If the demand exceeds the generation, then this, as I will explain in detail later, may cause a blackout. Then, if too much demand is such a big issue, why not to produce more electricity? Well, if generation exceeds the demand, then there is no way of storing that energy at scale and we need to throw it away. But keep in mind that to generate that electricity, for instance, gas was burned. And the gas was bought and will have to be paid for by the final consumer, even if that power is wasted. Thus, if we generate more electricity than needed, our bills will go up. This means that we need a perfect balance between generation and demand. Note that this is a very complex problem. There are more than 28 million households in the UK, thousands of factories, and an increasing number of electrical cars. On the other side, while classical generators are in the hundreds, wind farms and solar generations brings in 100 times as many generators as before. This is because a single wind turbine generates a fraction of the energy generated by a classical generator, and a solar panel produces a fraction of the energy produced by a wind turbine. Specifically, you can think that you need about 200 wind turbines to replace a single classical gas plant. This very complex system is balanced by the NESO Control Centre. Think of the control center as the conductor of an orchestra. It doesn't generate electricity itself. Like an orchestra, conductor does not play music, but it coordinates all the players, power stations, renewables, and demand from users to make sure that everything stays in harmony. And just like a conductor, it can adjust things if they start to go off key. So the engineers in the control center are constantly monitoring the grid. Every second, they are making decisions that affect how electricity flows across the country. How do they achieve this perfect balance? Well, mostly by predicting the future. NESO uses a structured approach to predicting electricity demand and generation in the UK, with forecasts tailored for different time frames. These predictions help them manage the grid efficiently and prevent issues like supply shortages or blackouts. Here's how their prediction process works. First, there is a 24 to 4 hours ahead prediction window. The NESO predicts electricity demand over the next 24 hours, breaking it down into smaller intervals of, for instance, 30 minutes or 1 hour. These forecasts are based on weather conditions, historical data, seasonal trends, and real-time consumption patterns. Factors like temperature and time of the day play a significant role since they influence heating, cooling, and industrial activities. They also take into account special events such as important sport events. For instance, during the half-time of the 2020 Euro semi-final between England and Denmark, there was a 1,400 megawatt peak of energy demand, caused by people taking a break, switching on the lights in the bathroom, or making a tea. The NESO also forecasts the generation capacity of various power sources, including renewables like wind and solar, along with more traditional generation such as gas, coal, and nuclear. They consider the expected performance of these plants, as well as renewable generation predictions based on weather conditions. Based on this forecast, the NESO plans to balance supply and demand in real time. Once we reach 4 hours ahead, we have a new phase. At this stage, the NESO has a better understanding of which generation plants are expected to be online and can adjust reserves accordingly. During this time frame, the NESO works to ensure that the energy mix is optimized for cost and sustainability. For instance, they prioritized low-carbon sources like wind and solar when they are available, and look at fossil fuel plants or storage for backup when renewable output is low. In summary, NESO's forecasting system plays a crucial role in maintaining grid stability, with different levels of accuracy and detail to ensure that the UK's electricity grid is reliably balanced between supply and demand. And for the most part, this works fine. But then, what causes blackouts? To understand this, we need to understand better how a synchronous generator, which I mentioned earlier, works. As I said before, classical generators, namely synchronous machines, transform mechanical energy in electricity. How do they do so? They operate based on the principle of electromagnetic induction, converting mechanical energy into electrical energy while maintaining synchronization with the frequency of the power grid. A synchronous generator is made of two basic components. A rotor. This is a rotating part of the generator. It is typically a large electromagnet or permanent magnet that creates a magnetic field. And a stator. This is a stationary part of the generator. It consists of coils of wire, usually copper, that are located around the rotor. As the rotor spins, the magnetic field interacts with the stator coils, inducing a flow of electric current in the stator. To recap, the core principle behind a synchronous generator is electromagnetic induction. Steam is used to make the rotor rotate. When the rotor spins, it creates a rotating magnetic field. This field passes through the coils of the stator, and according to Faraday's law of induction, a voltage is induced in the stator coils. Imagine that the rotor has four magnets spaced at 90 degrees from each other. The magnetic field will be stronger at the center of the magnet and will drop as you go far from the magnet. Thus, as the rotor spins, the strength of the magnet field as perceived by a coil in the stator will go up and down depending on how close the point is to the centers of the four rotating magnets. The result is that the induced voltage is alternating, and the frequency of the alternating current depends on the speed at which the rotor turns. The rotor speed is controlled to match the frequency of the grid it is connected to, typically 50 Hz in the UK or 60 Hz in some other countries. A key characteristic of synchronous generators is that they must synchronize with the grid. The generator's rotor must rotate at a speed that matches the grid's frequency. For example, if the grid is operating at 50 Hz, the rotor speed must be such that it produces exactly 50 cycles per second of the induced alternating current. If the rotor speed deviates from the required speed, the generator will no longer produce electricity at the correct frequency. This will cause issues as the grid and our devices are designed to operate at an agreed-upon frequency, in our case 50 Hz. Thus, if the frequency is incorrect, this can cause faults and grid instability. This is why maintaining synchronization is crucial. Now, what is that controls the speed of the rotor? On the one hand, the speed depends on the input. A higher pressure steam will cause the rotor to spin faster, and this will increase the frequency, while a lower pressure steam will cause the rotor to spin slower and cause a drop in frequency. But because of energy conservation, the same principle applies to the output as well. If the demand increases, this will cause the frequency to drop. A simple way of understanding this is that if you extract more electrical energy, that energy needs to come from somewhere, and it comes from the kinetic energy spinning the rotor. Thus, increasing the extracted electrical energy will cause a drop in the kinetic energy. And since the kinetic energy is proportional to the square of the speed, a lower kinetic energy implies a lower speed. Since the speed of the rotor is connected to the frequency of the electricity of the electricity will go down. In summary, if the demand increases, this will cause a drop in the frequency. Synchronous generators are designed to operate in parallel with other generators. When multiple generators are connected to the same grid, they share the load. If one generator begins to fall behind or lose synchronization, other generators will adjust to share the load, helping maintaining system stability, so that across the grid the loss of frequency is negligible. This natural robustness is one of the main advantages of synchronous machines. Since the grid is very sensitive to a balance between demand and response, the NESO Control Centers have safety mechanisms in place. If, for instance, there is a sudden loss of generation, let's say because a tree falls on a transmission line and cuts it, then NESO will immediately activate reserve generations, which are always in standby. However, for the reason explained at the beginning of the video, the standby resources are finite. How much standby resources to have ready is actually a regulated matter, and the idea is that the standby resources need to be sufficient to compensate a very large loss of generation. Also, how much frequency drop NESO can allow is a regulated matter. Between 49.8 and 50.2 Hz, the grid is considered normal and within operational limit, so we're talking of just 0.5 margin. NESO is still within the statutory limit as long as the frequency is between 49.5 and 50.5 Hz. That means that up to 1 Hz of variation, NESO is still fine and respecting the limits. NESO must make sure that the frequency never exceeds this interval. So then what happened on the 19th of August 2019? On that day, Britain's electricity system was operating as normal. Weather conditions were anticipated and not unusual. The Met Office had issued yellow warnings of wind and rain for most of England and Wales, which, as you can imagine, it is not uncommon in the UK. Actually, it's just raining now and it's windy. There was some heavy rain and lightning, but nothing was special. Overall, the amount of electricity that homes, businesses and infrastructure across Britain will need for the day was forecast to be similar to what experienced on the previous Friday. Around 30% of the generation was from wind, 30% from gas, 20% from nuclear, 10% from interconnectors, and around 10% from water, pumped storage, and coal and biomasses. So it was a perfectly normal Friday. At 16, 52, 33 seconds and 490 milliseconds on Friday 19th of August 2019, a lightning strike caused a fault on the Eton-Soggon-Wimonley line. The fault affected the local distribution networks and approximately 150 MW of distributed generation disconnected from the networks due to a safety mechanism. This is normal. When the frequency starts to drop, the first line of defense is automatic protection systems. Within milliseconds of the generator failures, these systems began responding. Frequency-sensitive relays spread across the network detected the drop and sent signals to the NESO Control Centre. But even before operators can take action, automatic systems came into play. The grid has pre-programmed responses to significant frequency drops. The result is that within 80 milliseconds, the fault was rectified. But at 16, 52, 33 and 835 milliseconds, so less than half a second after the lightning strike, the voltage control systems at the Hornsea 1 offshore wind farm did not respond to the impact of the fault on the transmission systems as expected and became unstable. Hornsea 1 rapidly reduced its power generation from 799 MW to just 62, a reduction of 737 MW. Very shortly after, in a matter of milliseconds, the steam unit at Little Barford Power Station in Bedfordshire, producing 244 MW, disconnected from the transmission system. The speed sensor on the steam turbine produced a discrepancy, initiating its automatic control system to shut the unit down. The events above resulted in a cumulative power loss of more than 1,130 MW. Of generation within 1 second of the fault. The level of power loss caused the frequency of the electricity system to fall at a high rate. This rapid change triggered further safety mechanisms, and as a result, an additional 500 MW of distributed generation tripped off. The cumulative loss of generation at this point was around 1,500 MW. The NESO Control Centre activated its big guns, frequency response mechanisms. The frequency fall was arrested 25 seconds after the fault at 49.1 Hz and then started to recover, plateauing after 45 seconds at 49.2 Hz. And I remind you that this is below the minimum lower statutory limit frequency level of 49.5 Hz. But around a minute after the fault, one of the gas turbines at Little Barford, producing 210 MW, was shut down for safety due to too much steam pressure in its pipework. This caused a further net reduction in generation of 200 megawatts at 49 Hz, probably caused by protection mechanisms of distributed generation set to activate when the frequency falls to 49 Hz. At this point, the cumulative loss of generation was at least 1990 megawatts. The system frequency continued to fall, dropping below 48.8 Hz. This is it. We reached a level in which NESO needs to take extreme measures to stabilize the grid or risk a domino effect that will knock off the entire grid. The control center took the decision of disconnecting approximately 5% of the total national demand to balance the electricity system and restore its frequency. This is roughly equivalent to 1 million customers experiencing a blackout. This worked. System frequency started to recover, increasing above 48.8 Hz within 200 milliseconds. The second gas turbine at Little Barford, producing 180 megawatt, was manually tripped by plant staff around a minute and a half after the fault due to safety concern, but this had no substantial effect. System frequency continued to recover as the NESO Control Centre extracted additional frequency response and reserves, returning to 50 Hz within 5 minutes of the fault. Once the immediate crisis was over and the frequency was back within safe limits, the next phase began: restoring supply. Engineers were dispatched to inspect and repair any physical damage, and in this case, neither the wind farm nor the gas plant had been physically damaged, but they were simply tripped offline by their safety systems. At the same time, operators in the control center began to gradually reconnect the sections of the grid that were disconnected during the automatic load shedding. This must be done carefully. Reintroducing too much demand too quickly could cause the frequency to drop again. So, in general, reconnection happens in stages, with operators constantly monitoring the frequency and adjusting the supply to match the rising demand. But while the grid was reconnected in about 1 hour, the aftermath of the blackout takes much longer to recover from. In particular, for instance, disruption to trains lasted up to 24 hours. The 2019 blackout was a wake-up call for the UK grid. While the NESO systems worked as designed, the event revealed vulnerabilities, particularly the growing reliance on renewable energy sources like wind, which can be less predictable than traditional power station, makes the grid less reliable. Namely, what caused the blackout is not the lightning strike and the immediate fault at the Eden transmission line, but it was the fact that Hornsea, one offshore wind farm, disconnected for no apparent reason. Non-synchronous generation, such as wind farm and solar farms, are a completely different beast than classical generation. They have no large rotor, providing that natural robustness that I explained earlier. Now, let's be clear. Renewables like wind and solar are key to our energy future, but they also present new challenges for grid stability. When large generators like the Hornsea wind farm suddenly go offline, the loss of inertia, that is the natural stabilizing force provided by spinning rotors, makes it harder to maintain frequency stability. That's why grid operators are investing in new technologies like grid-forming inverters and advanced battery storage to help provide that fast frequency response that's needed in a renewable-heavy grid. As countries transition to greener energy, the role of the control center, such as the one that I covered in this video, will only become more critical. Managing frequency in a grid with more intermittent renewable sources requires advanced algorithms, faster response systems, and more resilient infrastructure. The future of electricity will be smarter, greener, and more interconnected, and such control centers will be at the heart of it all, ensuring that no matter what happens, the lights stay on. So the next time you flip a switch, remember the complex system behind it, from the control center to the frequency response services that keep the grid balanced. With every new challenge, the grid evolves, but one thing remains constant. Every day, a team of engineers guards and protects our electricity grid and keep the electricity flowing, no matter what. Thank you for watching and see you next time.